He walked up the street and the barber shop, and he stood right on the step and he shot into the barber shop. He moved right next door. The next step, he shot into a shoemaker shop, killing the shoemaker. I was still backing my truck up as I seen him go to a tailor shop, and he shot in there. After that, I backed up my truck and went for the police.
Did he appear nervous? Did he run? Did he look like a madman would look?
No, he was very cool and collected.
He never ran?
Never ran. No.
He walked slowly and
very
calmly?
Slowly. That's what made me think there was, I didn't know whether he was killer or what he was. He looked like a high school boy to me.
And he took deliberate aim before shooting these people?
That's right. He sure did.
This is not going to be a particularly polished or quick moving episode, and I want it to sort of be an open source project, as I will explain later on. When I first began brainstorming ideas for this channel, the initial premise was the intersection of history and crime. And it certainly wouldn't have been pioneering in this regard, but I've since decided to move in a broader direction, but I still wanted to produce some slightly nerdy content for all my crime heads out there. The primary goal of this video is to present a few incidents that people are largely unaware of. Because the so-called gun problem in the United States is often framed as a sign of the times, symptomatic of an American spirit unmoored in suffering in an unstable modernity. The truth is, as you know, rarely that simple.
Asked us today whether these shootings are happening more often, and we were a little surprised when our research department put together a timeline. The Colorado Movie Massacre killed 12 on July 20th, 2012. 2 weeks later, 6 died at a temple in Wisconsin. The next month, 6 dead in an office in Minneapolis. It was quiet for 2 months when Newtown, Connecticut happened, killing 27. 2 weeks after that, 2 firemen were killed by a sniper in New York State. 2 months later, 4 dead at a barber shop in New York. The next month, 4 dead at an apartment in Washington State. 5 weeks later, 5 killed in Santa Monica, California. The next month, 6 dead in Hialeah, Florida. 7 weeks later, 12 murdered at the Washington Navy Yard. And 6 weeks after that came LAX. That's 85 dead in 11 mass shootings in just over a year.
Some folks working in the true crime space like to refer to the period between the late 1960s and the mid-1980s as quote-unquote the golden age of serial killers. Now, I'm not a huge fan of such periodization, mostly because they tend to offer limited historiographical value, and in a case like this, it's just sort of downright tacky and off-putting. But seeing as it's a common enough coinage, it's not surprising that because arguably the dominant mode of extreme violence in the American social landscape has shifted from serial murder to public mass shootings, that the phrasing has been repurposed to describe the mid-2000s to the present day as the quote-unquote golden age of mass shooting. A pseudo-historical designation like this is not always going to be borne out statistically, but most Americans with access to cable news and the internet would claim that in this case, it undoubtedly is. Can there really be a question that incidents have increased in both frequency and intensity over the last 25 to 30 years? Well, there is an academic debate to be had there. Part of the problem is how difficult it can be for any researchers reaching across disciplines to parse out the boundaries of such terms. Because federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI do not track mass shootings as separate from mass murders or quote-unquote active shooters, and therefore have not formalized an in-house definition. This means a few non-profit institutes and other organizations have had to make independent attempts to fill in this data gap, and they are often inconsistent between themselves. For example, the Gun Violence Archive casts the widest net by defining a mass shooting based only on the numeric value of 4 or more shot, not including the shooter, regardless of victim mortality rate or motivations and underlying criminal activity. By their count, 32 mass shootings have occurred in 2021 between January 1st and January 30th, which resulted in 28 deaths. The Stanford Mass Shootings of America project operates on a more refined definition of 3 or more shooting victims, not necessarily fatalities, not including the shooter. The shooting must not be identifiably gang, drug, or organized crime related. So this is more in line with the media-driven, culturally determined conception of a mass shooting, where the shooting is an end in and of itself. The Violence Project brackets out even more variables by not only excluding underlying criminal activity, but also commonplace circumstance. Things like insurance fraud, bar fights, crimes of passion involving adultery, catfishing, and the like. They also specify that a public or semi-public location, such as a school or workplace, is a key element to what makes mass shootings its own discrete phenomena. So while this would rule out most domestic violence situations, it's important to remember that many well-known public mass shootings also involve an associated incident of familicide in a separate location, such as Sandy Hook or the University of Texas events. Some limit the definition even further to at least 50% of the victims being unrelated by blood to the shooter. There's also the question of whether a quote-unquote true mass shooting can only be perpetrated by a lone wolf gunman at a single location. This could potentially remove Columbine or the Port Arthur massacre and other spree killings from the list, perhaps limiting usage to either single shooters or a pair of shooters with a pathological codependency would be helpful. Another complicating factor is the question of terrorism, which would technically be a form of underlying criminal activity. But can we honestly say that the Pulse nightclub shootings or even the Charleston church massacre don't count? That would just feel very wrong. There's no getting around that most normal people believe mass shootings to be uniquely horrifying crimes. The sheer amount of damage a single disturbed individual can inflict on an unsuspecting population of unarmed civilians is so profound that the whole of society appears to be consistently traumatized every time it occurs, no matter how often. And on an intuitive level, there does seem to be something decidedly modern about them. But as we'll see, that intuition doesn't quite hold up. Now, I'm not here to sculpt some perfect, platonic ideal of a mass shooting, just to invite you to think critically as we move forward through the main topic. If there's one thing you can say about me, it's that I'm a taxonomy nerd. I love indices, glossaries, spreadsheets, charts, and full accountings of categories. And this obviously has to include even the sort of fucked up and macabre devil's arithmetic involved in gathering data on topics murderous as far back as possible. And while there aren't exactly gaggles of academics who are studying pre-World War II mass shootings, it is inevitable that more scholars will eventually, in order to examine historical trends in crime, media, weapons technology, etc. And so a thorough accounting is the first step, and it is one that has not been completed to my personal satisfaction yet. So what we're going to do right now is look at a couple secondary sources and work backwards to primary sources and see what we can find. The stories are fascinating, albeit upsetting. So let's start where any normal weirdo like myself who Googles history of mass shootings would probably start their journey. Here we have BehindTheTower.org, which commemorates the 1966 University of Texas at Austin bell tower shooting committed by Charles Whitman. This incident is often used as a bookend marking the birth of our modern era of mass shootings, with some justification. And one of the pages on this site is titled A Brief History of Mass Shootings by Maria Esther Hammack, a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas History Department. Now, most of her scholarship is centered on slavery and black life in 19th century Texas, and it seems quite good. And it's important to say that this is not a peer-reviewed article in an academic journal, so it's not necessarily fair to hold it to similar standards. But I do think it's fair to take a closer look. So, we will use the timeline she provides and go through a couple. According to her research, quote, disturbing and senseless shootings have occurred since 1891 in this country. I'm not sure if this means that she decided to limit the scope of her research to a random year, which is obviously fine, you do have to start somewhere, or if she looked and couldn't locate any older incidents. Regardless, the first mass shooting, according to Hammack, is listed as the Parson Hall School shooting. Quote, on March 28, 1891, a man with a double-barreled shotgun fired upon a crowd of students and faculty attending a school exhibition in Parson Hall Schoolhouse in Liberty, Mississippi. As her source, Hammack cites an article in the Aspen Chronicle on March 30th, 1891. So let's see if we can get more details, because this does sound like a wild story and I am interested. Okay, so she provided the article, Dateline New Orleans, March 30th, 1891. There is some dated language in this that could be offensive to some people. A brutal attempt at wholesale murder was made at New Zion Church near Liberty, Mississippi Saturday night. At a school examination concert which was given at the Parson Hall Schoolhouse where Mrs. Dixon, colored, had just closed a public school for colored children. While the teacher and her pupils were arranging for the entertainment of a large audience of colored people and quite a number of white persons, and the improvised auditorium was crowded with the teachers, pupils, and spectators, a double-barreled shotgun, heavily loaded with shot, was fired into the assembly by some miscreant, wounding, it is said, 14 persons, some of them seriously and others slightly. Baldwin Hayes will probably lose one of his eyes. The assassin has not yet been discovered. So, if we take this Colorado newspaper article, Dateline in Louisiana, about an event in Mississippi at face value, we can see there's some confusing details. Now, I'm about to get very granular. So if this doesn't interest you, feel free to go turn on a PragerU video or whatever, because I stand for the gran. Anyway, this article doesn't really make the location of the crime clear. Did the shooting happen at a schoolhouse, or at a church hosting a school event, or maybe a schoolhouse that was part of a church? And also, was the shooting perhaps racially motivated? We're talking post-Reconstruction Mississippi, right? So maybe we can find more coverage in a newspaper closer to the action. So on March 31st, the Ogden Daily Commercial in Utah, so not that much closer, but, you know, titled, "An Infamous Outrage, a Brutal and Cowardly Attack Upon a Southern Colored School." While not every single word in this article is exactly the same as the Aspen Chronicle story, it seems like maybe they were drawing on the same wire service source or the same interviews. The Associated Press and Reuters had both been around for a few decades. This piece does offer the full name of Ida Dixon, as well as still describing the shooter as a quote-unquote unknown miscreant, which is sort of a fun, old-fashioned way to add color to a story about attempted child murder. Most importantly, though, we see a discrepancy in the name of the school, written here as Parson Hill. So maybe we can find at least one more source and see if we can pin down the name. Okay, so the Oakland Tribune out of California confirms the Parson Hill spelling. And then also check out this subheadline, quote, "A Mississippi outrage of a rather more extreme type than usual." They do not write them like that anymore. Okay, so we have confirmed a mass shooting in 1891 in multiple contemporaneous press accounts. Based on the info available, no one was killed, but over a dozen were injured. This fulfills the designatory requirement for at least the gun violence archive. According to Hammock's timeline, just 12 days later, on April 9, 1891, in Newburgh, New York, quote, "James Foster went inside St. Mary's Parochial School and opened fire." Her citation leads us not to a primary source, but a book published in 2012 titled Fatal Violence, Case Studies and Analysis of Emerging Forms by Ronald M. Holmes and Stephen T. Holmes. So let's find the cited page and get more info on this. Here on page 139, we can see, quote, "One of the earliest school shootings occurred in Newburgh, New York in 1891. James Foster, 70, fired a shotgun at a group of young boys from St. Mary's School, wounding several," end quote. So far so good. We can see Holmes cites New York Times, which is good for us, because it shouldn't be hard for us to find the original article and get a sense of the full story. But searching James Foster, 1891, in the Times archive comes up empty. So someone is getting something wrong here. So if we search by the school's name, we can pull up this article. Headline, "Fired into a Group of Children." Newburgh, New York, April 9th, 1891. While a group of children were playing in front of St. Mary's Parochial School this morning, James H. Ferguson, age 70, came along with a shotgun on his shoulder. Without warning or provocation, he raised the gun to his shoulder, took deliberate aim, and fired into a crowd of boys. He was 60 feet distant, and the charge was a mustard seed-sized shot. Consequently, none of the children were killed, although several were filled with lead. One boy, named Barnes, had 60 shot in his face and hands. Ferguson was arrested. It is thought he is demented. So, this definitely seems like the incident in question, but for some reason, Ferguson became Foster over time. So let's try and find another source or two, perhaps to get a more detailed narrative. Here we have the New York Evening World's coverage. An insane man seriously wounds 3 Newburgh boys. Alright, James H. Ferguson, who is supposed to be insane, fired a double-barreled shotgun into a group of children at St. Mary's Parochial School this morning on Gidney Avenue. Several of the children were wounded by the shot, Frank Barnes, 10 years old, being dangerously hurt. More than 20 shots struck him in the face and the neck. He may die. Others who were seriously hurt were Joseph Stapleton and Lawrence Tobiah. Ferguson was arrested. he has acted strangely for several weeks. Okay, so this doesn't seem to diverge too significantly from the Times article, but we also discover that 3 boys were seriously hurt, but the Middleburg Times Press published a slightly more in-depth account. Headline: A villain fires into a group of children. Newburgh, April 9th. This morning at 10:30, as the children of St. Mary's Parochial School were playing on Gidney Avenue, James H. Ferguson was seen coming on the opposite side of the street. He was carrying a double-barreled shotgun. When almost opposite a group of boys and girls, he placed the gun to his shoulder, took aim, and fired into the children, none of whom were more than 12 years of age. After discharging his weapon, Ferguson ran away, not stopping to ascertain what the result of his dastardly act had been, and several of the children were wounded, the most serious injuries being sustained by Frank Barnes, age 10. He received upwards of 20 shots in various parts of the upper portion of his body, 11 being in his face, 3 in the neck, and several in the ear, cutting away the small portion, and 1 directly on the edge of the eye. The right hand received half a dozen, and the back of the woolen jacket was filled with small pieces of lead. Joseph Stapleton and Lawrence Tobiah are known to have been injured, but it is not certain at this time whether seriously or not. The sister in charge of the school sent the wounded children home at once, and the Barnes boy was taken by the police to headquarters. The shot were of the kind known as small bird shot, the size of a pinhead. Owing to the distance between Ferguson and his victims, the shot did not penetrate far into the flesh. It is said that Ferguson had been acting strangely for some time, and for a day or two has been carrying a gun with him wherever he went. The shooting caused a sensation and great excitement when it became noted abroad. Ferguson was caught and locked up. Okay, so this was still reporting 3 injured, none killed, with some more background on Ferguson, who seemed to have suffered some sort of psychotic episode or mental break. The shooting took place in public and was an end in itself, fitting within those specific parameters of a mass shooting. So would this be on an official list? It's hard to say. Before moving on to Hammock's next entry, I would like to introduce a new secondary source I consulted while putting this together. It is the work of historian and criminologist Grant Dewey, who currently holds the position of research director for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. And full disclosure, I did reach out to Dr. Dewey hoping to conduct an interview, but got no response, and I'm hoping we can do that in the future. His scholarship on mass murder in the United States really is indispensable, and I would encourage anyone interested to get a copy of his 2007 book. In 2017, Dewey contributed a chapter in the Wiley Handbook of the Psychology of Mass Shootings. In it, he offers his own definition as, quote, incidents which occur in the absence of other criminal activity in which a gun was used to kill 4 or more victims at a public location, end quote. He attempts to address the question of increasing prevalence, cataloging 24 mass shootings during the 50 years prior to the Austin Bell Tower shooting, and 135 during the subsequent 5 decades. But then he complicates the raw numbers by controlling for population growth, proving they are in line with general trends in crime. All of this is to say that if there's a true expert on the topic of this video, it is him, and he identifies the first mass public shooting in the 20th century to likely have occurred in 1915 in Brunswick, Georgia. Now, I am going to disagree with him in a minute, but we should read a little more about this particular case by turning to the March 7th, 1915 issue of the Atlanta Constitution. Dateline, Brunswick, Georgia, March 6th. Claiming that prominent Brunswick businessmen had stolen $25,000 from him and declaring he had a list of 6 whom he intended to murder, Monroe Phillips, a real estate and timber dealer, armed with an automatic shotgun, ran amok for half an hour in the business district here today, killed 5 citizens, wounded 32, and was himself shot dead. The cause of the shooting is gradually leaking out. The drama staged so horribly has a background extending for several years. Recently, he has been suffering from the delusion that local people had wronged him. It is known that Phillips had been involved in much litigation since his residence in Brunswick. A few days ago, he sold a lighter to Savannah parties, and the purchase money was tied up in attachments. Colonel Dunwoody represented some of the claimants, and an hour before the shooting, Phillips and Dunwoody discussed the matter over the phone. Phillips then took his shotgun and went out for trouble. He had claimed to friends that prominent Brunswick businessmen had stolen $25,000 from him, and he had a list of 6 whom he intended to murder today. After he had killed 2 men, he walked into the office of Albert Fendig with the express purpose of murdering him, and also sought R.E. Bresnik and others. It was the busiest hour of the day that Phillips, carrying his shotgun, walked into the office of Colonel Dunwoody on the 2nd floor of a building in the center of the business district. He fired 2 barrels into the lawyer's head, killing him instantly. Phillips then shot Albert M. Way, who was in Dunwoody's office. The slayer then walked down the stairs to the street, where several citizens attracted by the shots had gathered. Phillips fired into the crowd, killing Paget. Then he began shooting into a crowd of men who collected on the opposite side of the street, wounding several citizens and killing Aspel. Pedestrians began running to places for shelter. Phillips reloaded his gun as he walked to the corner of Newcastle and Gloucester Streets and took up his station in front of a drugstore, where he began shooting at every person who appeared on the street. Several persons standing blocks away from the drugstore were struck by stray shots. Mr. Hackett was killed as he stepped from a building onto the street. Presently, policeman Deaver came running up to the scene and began shooting at Phillips, who turned his shotgun upon the officer and shot him dead. A bullet from the policeman's revolver, however, wounded Phillips. Mr. Butts, who had been struck by a shot from Phillips' gun, rushed to a hardware store, obtaining a pistol, began firing at the crazed timber dealer. A bullet from the lawyer's pistol finally struck Phillips, and he fell to the sidewalk, dying within a few minutes. Now, for sure, this has all the hallmarks of a mass shooting that would have received wall-to-wall cable coverage in the early 1990s. And if it happened tomorrow, say, would probably make it into the national news cycle for a day or two. And the NRA, in its current incarnation, might even have lent the events its signature signal boost, as it could fit their good guy with a gun returning fire narrative. Now, the reason I want to dispute the status of the Brunswick Rampage as the first mass shooting is as follows. Let's turn back to Hammock's timeline. As we can see, the Brunswick shooting does not make an appearance at all. But following the Newburgh shotgun episode is the Kamen Band School massacre in Winfield, Kansas. Hammock describes it, quote, "On August 14th of 1903, Gilbert Twigg, a war veteran, deliberately fired into a crowd of people in Winfield, Kansas, killing 9 and wounding 25 unsuspecting others." Of all the incidents discussed in this video, the Winfield shooting is arguably the most publicized at the time. It has remained of interest to historians and the popular press in the decades since. BuzzFeed even did a decent write-up a few years ago. But let's go ahead and examine some of the contemporaneous coverage. Alright, so this is an article in the Sharon Advocate. Last Thursday evening, Winfield was the scene of the most appalling shooting affray in the history of Kansas when Gilbert Twigg, a miller, shot down 4 people, fatally wounded 2 more, and injured 15 others. Gilbert Twigg, the man who did the shooting, was a miller in Winfield. He had been there many years and was quite well known. He was found in an alley, dressed in dark trousers and Rough Rider's khaki coat and hat. The shooting occurred a few minutes before 9 o'clock at the corner of 9th and Main Streets. Kamen's band was giving the regular weekly concert on the corner, when suddenly, without a warning shot, the young man began firing from the alley west of Main Street. He had a double-barreled shotgun and fired a dozen shots into the crowd. The revolver he turned on himself. 2,000 or 3,000 people were attending the concert, and the streets were pammed, and during the intermission between the 3rd and 4th numbers the shooting occurred. The young man was in the dark behind the Oddfellows building, and suddenly the shots rang out in rapid succession, there being only a slight intermission between the shotgun volley and that of the revolver. The shotgun was loaded with number 5 buckshot, and they veritably mowed down the crowd within its range. Then followed the revolver bullet, which killed the murderer. The shooting was done so quickly that the people hardly knew what was happening until it was all over. He was certainly insane. None other but a maniac could have thought of and carried out such a deed. He was reputed to be a very bright young man, about 33 years old, and his friends could scarcely believe he could ever do such a thing as wantonly shooting into a great crowd of friends. Twigg had formerly served as a soldier in the Philippines War, and says at one time was forced to relinquish a position paying him a salary of $100 per month by the people of Winfield. He also accuses them of having watched his mails to ascertain with whom he corresponded. He undoubtedly labored under the delusion that everyone was his enemy, and no one his friend. So I think we can agree that this is a classic public mass shooting by anyone's definition, with all the hallmarks of body count, location, indiscrimination, and shooter biography, as well as all the attendant melodrama in its media treatment. So I remain confused as to why Professor Dewey left this out of his otherwise stellar work. Now we are going to jump around a little bit in both directions chronologically before we wrap up here. Fast forward ahead to a cluster of shootings where we can really see the construction of a social problem with a particular name, because the phraseology of mass shooting does not really appear in the printed discussions of any of the early examples that we've gone over. But the lexicon begins to change even prior to the Austin Bell Tower shooting. I showed you some newsreel footage at the beginning of this video that was produced during the aftermath of 13 murders committed by Howard Unruh at Camden, New Jersey on September 6, 1949. The incident was highly sensationalized and was followed shortly thereafter by 2 additional shootings that were believed to be either copycats or representative of a new trend in antisocial behavior. Here's an article which makes use of the term mass shooting 70 years ago. So this was in the Miami News, but it's Dateline Detroit, October 27th, 1949. Recent mass shootings by two berserk gunmen could easily influence other unbalanced persons to seek release in bloodshed, a Wayne University psychologist warned today. Dr. Wilson McTeer, associate professor of psychology, said a deadly chain reaction might follow the shooting sprees of Howard Unruh, the Camden, New Jersey killer, and Joseph Runyon, 57-year-old Waterford, Michigan farmer who shot down 9 persons Monday. There's so little we can do to correct the situation, he said. It's very disturbing. McTeer said it was altogether possible that Runyon, distraught over loss of his livestock and other misfortunes, got the idea for blasting 9 bar patrons from news accounts of the Unruh case. Quote, now the Runyon case is spread across the country, he said, and a social pattern emerges. If these things occur in quick succession, like flying saucers and war scares and sit-down strikes, people with mental conflict will be tempted to think that such an outlet would end worries. When a person is beset with troubles, which he feels simply cannot stand, he wants a way out. For some it is suicide, for others it can mean a split personality, or perhaps amnesia. The Runyon case, from published reports, is not unusual, McTeer noted. He was divorced, and lately, bad luck, the loss of his horses and pigs, had him down. He felt that at his age he was just too old to start over again. He may have been upset that other people escaped such troubles. So the Unruh story was repeated, and McTeer warned the repetition could continue. The national conversation in 1949 can be heard echoing far into the future. What role does mental illness play in a given mass shooting? Is the action the result of a slow buildup of stress, or is there a breaking point where a single stroke of bad luck causes one to snap? Should we turn to sociologists or psychiatrists for solutions? Finally, I would like to submit 2 incidents which predate all of the shootings discussed thus far and do not appear in any of the indices or catalogs that I have had the opportunity to review. These were stumbled upon in the course of my own research. Alright, so this is the Pittsburgh Daily Post, August 24th, 1885, but Dateline, Indianapolis, Indiana. Maddened by liquor, Fred Berkey shoots 4 persons, 1 fatally. The Journal's Salem, Indiana special reports a terrible case of drunken madness. Fred Berkey Jr., son of one of the leading citizens of the place, while intoxicated, appeared on the street and began an indiscriminate fusillade. He fired 9 shots aiming at whoever happened to be in range. Laura Klerner received 2 balls, one in the wrist and one in the shoulder. William McClanahan was shot through his hand. W.S. Persice sustained a flesh wound in the thigh. Jordan Payne received a ball through the body, just below the heart, and will probably die. Payne, when shot, was in a buggy with a companion. Dragging Payne from the buggy, Berkey compelled the other man to drive on, and attempted to escape. Finding this impossible, he placed a pistol to his head and fired, killing himself. No cause is known for the bloody work, except that Berkey was completely maddened by the liquor he had swallowed. And here are some other articles I found on the same incident. And lastly, we've got the Indianapolis News, but Dateline Chicago, September 2nd, 1881. So this is the earliest one that I've found. A lunatic run amok in Chicago. Chicago, September 2nd. John C. Neal, a crazy stranger last night, about 1 o'clock, rose from the bed of his lodging house at 353 Clark Street with a wild yell, suddenly placing a revolver at the head of another inmate of the room, David Fagan, and fired. He then darted downstairs to the office and with an Indian war whoop, shot the only occupant, an old Swede, in the back. He took a running jump out of a window, struck squarely on his feet, and started on a dead run down Clark Street, firing as he ran, and hitting Henry Johnson, who tried to stop him. Reaching Polk Street, he fired at close range at Thomas Flynn, a railroad flagman, and William Wolfe, depot watchman, who were sitting together. Running still further, he snapped his revolver twice at a policeman, who clubbed the excited lunatic, and after a violent struggle, got him to the armory. The wounds of Wolfe, Springward, and Johnson are serious and may prove fatal. He claims to have been a grocer in Troy, New York. And then here is just an image of another article I found on the same incident. Okay guys, thanks for indulging me. I'm sort of hoping to keep a master list of these as I continue to go into the archives. So if you guys find anything, any especially late 19th century, mid to late 19th century examples of this, please let me know and send them my way. Email is in the description. Thank you so much.